It had rained all evening, that light Oxford rain that doesn't so much fall as linger, a silver mist that hangs from lamps and hoods alike. I had left the Randolph earlier than usual, uneasy with the company of a particularly boisterous don from Balliol who insisted that Keats had been overrated. I walked slowly down St. Giles, collar turned up, the cobbles shining like the skin of some quiet fish beneath the streetlight. The gates of Corpus were being locked as I passed. Routine, of course, at 10:30, though I caught sight of a porter's lantern flickering near the archway, and above it a faint square of light from one of the upper windows. It was the kind of detail that shouldn't have mattered, except that it did. I remember thinking, with the trivial certainty of a man half pickled in whiskey, that someone had forgotten themselves, or perhaps chosen not to remember. When I read the following morning that Dr. Adrian Kellaway, Fellow of Corpus Christi College, had been found dead at his desk, I thought first not of tragedy, but of that window. The paper reported no suspicious circumstances, a phrase so frequently employed that it had begun to lose meaning. I finished my coffee, stared at the crossword, and wondered why the word finality fit too easily into the space meant for truth. By noon, I was standing in the quad itself. The air still smelt faintly of rain and paper, of leaves plastered against old stone. Lewis met me there, carrying his usual unease like a badge. He said something about it being heart trouble, that the college doctor had already signed the certificate. But I had already begun to notice small contradictions. The position of the curtains drawn halfway, the desk lamp tilted awkwardly toward a pile of Greek texts as if it had been moved in haste, and that crossword again, folded neatly beside an unfinished glass of red wine. Kellaway, I remembered, had once been a scholar of Latin elegy, a quiet man, well regarded but not beloved. A reputation for austerity clung to him like chalk dust. Still, his room betrayed more than study. A pair of glasses, one rimmed faintly with lipstick, a faint scent of lilac that no man wears willingly. There was also a small bottle of pills, open but not empty. Heart medication, perhaps, though I doubted it. The head of college was courteous enough, as heads of college tend to be when faced with police intrusion. He assured me that Dr. Kellaway had no enemies, no debts, and no recent visitors. I nodded, as one does when told that death is convenient. But when I asked about Kellaway's personal papers, his tone shifted, from polite to guarded. They would, he said, be reviewed by the bursar before release. I smiled. Lewis, ever practical, frowned in the background, as if my patience were a form of indulgence. It was the porter, though, who gave me the first real clue. Not intentionally. Few do. He mentioned that Kellaway had been working later than usual these past weeks, lights burning long after the college gates were locked, sometimes until dawn. He'd thought nothing of it. Scholars, after all, are a nocturnal species. But one evening, he'd looked up to see a shadow move across that same lit window. 2 silhouettes, not one. The porter had shrugged it off as reflection. I did not. That night, back at home, I poured a drink and spread out my notes beneath the soft amber glow of the reading lamp. The crossword from the Oxford Mail lay open beside me. A triviality, yet one word caught my attention. Lux. Light. It had been the solution to the first clue. It guides even the blind. 3. I thought again of the window in Corpus, the last light burning long after the world had turned dark. Lewis called before midnight, saying the coroner was satisfied. Heart failure, no inquest necessary. I told him to let it rest for now. He hesitated, then asked if I believed it. I said nothing. There are moments when silence is kinder than certainty. When I finally switched off my own lamp, I caught my reflection in the glass. Tired, middle-aged, a man whose curiosity was merely another form of loneliness. Somewhere in the city, the bells of Merton chimed the hour. I listened until the echoes faded, thinking that Oxford, for all its knowledge, remains a city of unanswered questions. And one of them had just died alone beneath that unblinking light. The morning after Kellaway's death began with a silence that felt heavier than most. Oxford, on such days, seems to move at half its usual speed. Bicycles gliding like shadows, pigeons walking solemnly along parapets, and the air itself scented faintly with chalk and damp wool. Lewis and I walked beneath the stone arch of Corpus just as the porter was folding his newspaper with that deliberate reverence the English reserve for small tragedies. The room where Kellaway had died was precisely as I had imagined it would be, a scholar's kingdom of neat disorder. The curtains drawn halfway, the lamplight golden and unsympathetic. Shelves burdened with Latin elegies, Greek fragments, and the slow suffocation of uncompleted ideas. The air was close, stale with paper and the faint sweetness of old wine. I remember thinking that intellect, like dust, gathers quietly in the corners. Lewis busied himself examining the decanter, the open notebook, the half-finished crossword. I told him to note nothing for the moment. The human eye, I said, is at its most useful before it starts recording. He looked at me as if I'd asked him to pray. I moved toward the desk. Kellaway's hand had left a faint smudge across the top of a page, the pressure of fingers that had hesitated. The writing, in its rigid academic script, ended mid-sentence. I had seen enough abandoned thoughts in my own time to know what that meant. The head of college arrived soon after, accompanied by a faint odor of expensive soap and exhaustion. He spoke with a kind of politeness that implies secrecy. Kellaway, he said, had been a man of deep principle, tireless, solitary, unworldly. No enemies to speak of. When I asked if that included friends, he smiled thinly and said that scholars of Kellaway's temperament preferred books to people. A young woman joined us shortly afterward. Claire Heston, a lecturer barely into her 30s, with a sharpness of tone that could wound and charm in equal measure. She had been one of Kellaway's protégés, though there was something in her voice that suggested the relationship had soured. She insisted she had last seen him 3 days before his death, when she had gone to withdraw a paper they were due to publish jointly. No, she said, she would rather not explain why. Her hands were clasped tightly around a sheaf of notes, the paper trembling slightly, though her voice did not. Lewis, ever literal, asked her if Kellaway had enemies. She gave a short laugh, not unkind, but weary. In academia, she said, integrity was more dangerous than deceit. Kellaway, she implied, had been both. When she left, I turned my attention to the book open on Kellaway's desk. It was a volume of Catullus, heavily annotated in pencil. Beside one poem in the margin, he had written a small Latin phrase, lux mea deserta est. My light is gone. The words could have been poetic self-pity or something else entirely. I copied them into my notebook, underlining the final word. Lewis found the crossword. The clues were complex, precise, a private language of intellect and irony. One word caught my eye, a 5-letter solution for faith undone. Kellaway had written truth. Correct, perhaps, but not necessarily the right answer. It occurred to me that even in death, Kellaway was still playing games. Before leaving, I glanced once more around the room. There were 2 wine glasses on the table. One empty, one half full. The stains on the rim were not identical. It was a small thing, but small things are where meaning hides. When I asked the porter later whether Kellaway had ever entertained visitors, he frowned, uncertain. Only the occasional fellow, perhaps, or a student seeking guidance, but not recently. Walking back through the quad, I found myself thinking of the phrase unfinished lines. It described not only Kellaway's work, but his life, an intellect forever in pursuit of something just beyond comprehension. And yet, in his death, there was something disturbingly tidy, as though a man had decided that no line worth writing should ever be completed. That night I sat alone at my desk, the Catullus translation open beside me, a small lamp burning through the dark. The rain had returned, gentle and insistent. I traced the phrase again in my notes, lux mea deserta est, and wondered whether light can ever truly vanish, or if it merely changes form, hiding in the corners where language fails. The porter found it by accident. A single envelope, thin as regret, wedged between the pages of the register at the lodge. The handwriting was neat, feminine, deliberate, the kind of script that belongs to someone who once learned to write for beauty's sake. I remember turning it over in my hands, feeling the faint texture of foreign paper, the postmark blurred by rain. France. 2 days before Kellaway's death, it had been addressed simply. Dr. A. Kellaway, Corpus Christi College, Oxford. No title, no department, no formality. Just the man himself, as if the sender knew that would be enough. The porter, with the apologetic pride of one who has done something wrong without meaning to, said he'd forgotten to deliver it. It had slipped down the back of the counter, lost among term notices and invitations to high tables that no one attended anymore. Lewis stood beside me in the porter's lodge, tapping the envelope against his palm. He asked if it might be personal. I said everything was personal in Oxford, only the tone varied. We opened it there and then. A short letter, no more than a few lines. I have told him, forgive me, that was all. No signature, no clue except the faint scent of lavender and a watermark in the paper, Papeterie de Lyon. There was something unsettling about its brevity, a message that carried both confession and closure, but neither addressed to the living. I folded it carefully back into its envelope. Lewis thought it might be connected to the will, which, we'd just learned, contained an unnamed beneficiary. Perhaps, he said, the letter was from that person. Perhaps Kellaway's him referred to a solicitor, or a rival, or even God. I said nothing. That afternoon, we met with the college solicitor, an elderly man with the air of someone who believed paperwork could cleanse sin. He confirmed that Kellaway had indeed altered his will a fortnight before his death. The beneficiary, however, was not yet to be disclosed. A codicil, sealed and held in trust. His expression suggested irritation, not curiosity. Lawyers, I've found, resent mystery unless it comes with an hourly rate. Back at the station, I stared at the envelope under the harsh light of my desk lamp. Its edges were roughened by moisture, the ink slightly feathered, but the paper was too fine to have been bought casually. The kind that used to come in boxes, tied with a narrow ribbon. I had seen it once before. Years ago, in a file from a case involving a French woman living in Jericho. She'd written to her lover every Thursday, using the same lavender scent, the same paper. I remember because she'd ended her last letter with the same phrase. Forgive me. I wondered then about the unseen women who move quietly through the lives of men like Kellaway, women who understand too much and explain too little, the sort who can undo a scholar more efficiently than any scandal of plagiarism. Oxford has never lacked for them. Lewis came in later with tea and the expression of a man who dislikes half answers. He asked again what I thought it meant. I told him that perhaps the letter wasn't too late at all. Perhaps Kellaway had read it, and that was the problem. He frowned. You mean it killed him? I said I meant only that guilt is rarely a sudden thing. It accumulates like dust on unread books. After he left, I sat a long time listening to the rain against the window. The city was quiet. Somewhere, a bell struck the hour. Slow, deliberate, echoing. I turned the envelope over once more, noticing for the first time that the flap was slightly torn, as if someone had tried to open it before. It was a tiny thing, a hairline fracture in the narrative, but it altered everything. I locked the letter away before leaving for the night. Even then, I could not shake the feeling that it was not meant for Kellaway at all, that it had found the wrong hands, or worse, that it had reached exactly where it was intended, but not in time to save anyone. The first snow of the season came early that year, not the thick kind that muffles sound, but a dry scattering that seemed more like memory than weather. The lawns of Corpus lay half-covered, the gravel walks marked by hesitant footprints. I remember thinking how even Oxford's gardens appear to deliberate before aging. Lewis and I were walking toward the Fellows Building, summoned by Professor Julian Dale. He was Kellaway's senior by a decade and his rival by temperament, a man who had written one widely read book of romantic criticism 20 years ago and had spent the years since defending it, the sort of scholar who spoke as if language were an inheritance he'd been forced to share. He greeted us in the garden, his hands thrust into the pockets of a worn tweed coat, reciting a line before he spoke. Something about truth being a kind of music that others mistake for noise. I didn't correct him, though he'd misquoted it. Kellaway would have, and perhaps that was the point. Dale claimed to know little about the death. He had, however, much to say about the man. Kellaway, he told us, was intolerably moral, incapable of the small hypocrisies that make academic life bearable. He hinted, with a certain satisfaction, that the late Don had become obsessed with what he called academic corruption. Not money, of course. Vanity. Dale had the air of a man both wounded and flattered to have been suspected. As he spoke, I noticed the faint tremor in his left hand. Not age, I thought. Conscience, or perhaps caffeine. The garden around us was silent except for the sound of dripping from the stone gutters. A robin landed on the sundial, cocked its head, and flew away. When Lewis asked what Kellaway had been working on lately, Dale hesitated, a fraction too long. Then he said that Kellaway had been preparing a paper on romantic forgeries, the blurred line between imitation and truth. A subject, Dale added, that touched too close to home for certain of his colleagues. He smiled thinly. I had the impression of a man performing sincerity in front of a mirror. Later, in Kellaway's rooms, I found confirmation of that discomfort. Among the papers stacked neatly on his desk was a lecture draft, heavily corrected. One phrase, underlined twice, caught my eye. Genius is not the opposite of deceit. It is its perfection. The irony was elegant, almost cruel. It was Claire Heston who interrupted us there, appearing in the doorway with the expression of someone who has overheard too much. She asked what right we had to disturb his work. I told her truth is a rude guest. It enters without knocking. She said Kellaway had been wrong about many things. I asked which. She didn't answer. Her eyes, though, shifted briefly toward the garden below, the same one where Dale had stood quoting false poetry. After she left, Lewis muttered that she looked guilty. I said she looked like someone accustomed to regret. There's a difference. On the way out, I paused beside the college's small rose garden, stripped now to thorns and frost. It was there, Dale had said earlier, that Kellaway sometimes sat reading aloud to himself, reciting poems under his breath. The porter had confirmed it. The odd sight of an aging scholar among roses, whispering Latin verse to no one. The last poem he'd been heard reciting, apparently, was something by Yeats. The cold heaven. The phrase lingered as I walked back through the quad, snow melting against my coat. The cold heaven. The title of a man who knew too much of both. That evening, in my flat, I reread the inscription I'd copied from Kellaway's book. Lux mea deserta est. My light is gone. A melancholy sentiment, yes. But I began to wonder if it wasn't self-pity after all. Perhaps it was observation. Perhaps the light that had deserted him was not his own, but another's. Outside, the snow turned back to rain. The garden lay dark. Somewhere, I imagined, the robin returned to the sundial, still waiting, still untroubled by meaning. It was Lewis who persuaded me to attend the concert. A harmless evening, he'd said. Something to break the rhythm of death and deduction. I had no great affection for Schumann, but the program mentioned a young pianist from Corpus, and curiosity is a difficult habit to unlearn. The Sheldonian, with its echoing acoustics and smell of old varnish, was half empty, the audience consisting mostly of students and elderly couples who had long since replaced passion with routine. When she began to play, I did not immediately recognize her. The music was slow, deliberate, and almost brittle in its restraint. Only when she raised her head between movements did I see it was Claire Heston. The same pallor, the same fragile composure that seemed to carry both defiance and exhaustion. I wondered if she saw me. I doubted she was capable of surprise anymore. The final note lingered longer than it should have, trembling through the rafters like a held breath. The applause was polite. Nothing more. Yet when I met her outside afterward, she smiled faintly, as though the music had been for herself alone. I told her it had been beautiful. She said beauty was never her intention. I asked what was. She looked past me toward the lamplight reflecting in the wet cobblestones. Silence, she said. I wanted silence. We walked a little way together under the arches of Broad Street. She spoke slowly about Kellaway, about his severity, his sense of order. He'd once been her mother's tutor, she said, long before either of them should have known better. The relationship had ruined more than reputations. Her mother had left Oxford soon after, gone to France, and Claire had grown up with the name of a man she was not allowed to mention. It was only when she came to Corpus that she realized he was still there, older, untouched, pretending the past had been a youthful indiscretion best filed away. I asked if she confronted him. She nodded, eyes lowered. He had not denied it, she said, but claimed that love, his word, had demanded sacrifice. He believed in redemption through denial. I remember feeling a peculiar sympathy for both of them. Oxford breeds a kind of moral vanity, the belief that intellect can cleanse what emotion complicates. It rarely does. At her lodgings, she offered me a glass of wine she didn't drink. I asked if she'd written to him recently. For a moment, she hesitated. Long enough to matter. Then she said she had, yes, a letter she'd never meant him to read. It had been a confession, she said, and also a warning. When I told her the letter had arrived after his death, her hand trembled slightly. She said she had posted it late, then looked away, adding that there was nothing in it worth reading. But lies, I've learned, seldom announce themselves. They simply shift the air around them. Before I left, I noticed the music on her piano. The sheet was open to Schumann's Kinderscenen, and at the top she'd written a small annotation. Tranquillo, ma non troppo. Calmly, but not too much. The irony was exquisite. Later that night, I sat at home listening to a recording of the same piece. The melody drifted like smoke. Something half remembered, half mourned. I thought again of Claire's words, of her mother in France, of Kellaway's unyielding morality. There was, I felt, an unseen line running through them all, a melody composed of regret and precision. Then I noticed the crossword still lying on my desk. One clue. 4 letters. Musical term. To end. Gracefully. The answer was obvious, yet Kellaway had written it twice, boxing it neatly each time. Coda. I found myself staring at the repetition, wondering if it had been a mistake or a message meant for someone who would recognize the pattern. When I turned off the record player, the silence that followed was not peace, but a residue. Something shaped like music, but empty of sound. Oxford lay quiet beyond the window, its spires etched against the pale sky, listening with me to the echo of things left unsaid. There are moments, even in the most rational investigations, when reason falters, not through error, but through silence. That evening, Corpus lay under a thin film of rain, and I found myself walking again across its courtyard, drawn less by logic than by something quieter. The porter's lodge smelled of polish and burnt coffee. He seemed surprised to see me, though not displeased. He mentioned, quite without prompting, that on the night Dr. Kellaway died, he had seen 2 lights burning in the window, not one. It had troubled him in some small, unarticulated way. The upper lamp, he said, the reading lamp on the desk. That had burned as always. But for a few minutes, perhaps half an hour before midnight, another glow appeared lower down, nearer the window, softer. Then, suddenly, it went out. The porter assumed the Don had gone to bed. It was the kind of detail most men would forget before breakfast, but I have learned to trust the persistence of small truths. I thanked him, walked out into the drizzle, and stood where he must have stood that night beneath the archway. Even now, with the light gone, I could imagine it. 2 lamps, one steady, one flickering, the faint geometry of deception. Back inside, Lewis was waiting. He had been speaking with the cleaning staff, or as he called them, the women who notice things. One of them had remembered wiping 2 wine glasses from Kellaway's room the morning after his death. I asked what she'd done with them. She said she'd placed them back in the cupboard, as always. No one had told her to keep them. When I entered the study again, I found the decanter still on the sideboard, a half-inch of dark wine clinging to the bottom. I poured a little into the glass, held it to the light. A Bordeaux, I thought. Perhaps a Saint-Emilion. Expensive, too full-bodied for a solitary man. The rim of the glass bore a faint trace of lipstick. Not red, but the soft pink tone of someone who wanted not to be noticed. Lewis asked if I thought Kellaway had company that night. I said company is a poor word. It suggests cheerfulness. He said perhaps a student. I said perhaps a ghost. In truth, I had already begun to suspect who the visitor might have been, though suspicion in Oxford is as common as ivy. I could not help recalling Claire Heston's perfume, faint and floral, not unlike the scent that still lingered in the chair by the window. There is a kind of courage in visiting the dying, and an equal measure of vanity. We searched for fingerprints, of course. Procedure demands as much, but I knew that truth seldom leaves itself in smudges. Instead, I opened the drawer of Kellaway's desk. Inside, a single folded page of music manuscript. A few bars, nothing more, written in a firm, elegant hand. The melody, if it could be called that, rose and fell uncertainly, a pattern without resolution. At the top, a single word, lux. Light, again that word. Lewis thought it a coincidence. I didn't. I traced the notes with my finger. 4 bars repeated. 2 lights, 2 lives. I wondered if Kellaway had been composing something or if it was meant as a message, an echo of the crossword clue. The coda written twice. Outside, the rain intensified, beating softly against the panes. For a moment, the reflection of the lamp seemed doubled. One flame inside the glass, another trembling beyond it. I turned off the switch, leaving the room in half-darkness. The illusion vanished, but the impression remained, that what I saw was less a trick of light than of conscience. As we left, Lewis asked what I made of it all. I told him only that I was beginning to see the shape of something. Not the truth itself, but the outline it leaves when someone has tried to conceal it too neatly. He said he'd call the coroner again in the morning. I said not to bother. Some answers, I told him, do not reveal themselves under brighter lights. That night, alone at home, I poured a glass of whiskey and sat without music. The lamp on my desk glowed faintly, the rest of the room in shadow. Two lights again, one steady, one uncertain. And I found myself wondering, as I so often did, whether truth belongs to the living at all, or whether it is merely the last thing the dead leave burning for us to find. It was one of those evenings when Oxford appeared almost too composed, its beauty a form of deceit. The city glowed faintly beneath a low, pale mist, and even the bells of Christ Church seemed reluctant to announce the hour. I was walking toward the high, coat collar turned up, when Lewis called to remind me of the Fellows' dinner at Corpus. I told him to meet me there, though I had no appetite for wine or conversation. Still, one learns to attend such gatherings. They reveal more through discomfort than confession. The hall smelled of wax and old wood. The portraits, dimly lit, leaned forward as if eager to overhear. At the high table, Professor Julian Dale presided with the self-assurance of a man used to attention. He was quoting poetry before the soup had cooled. Lines of Tennyson, I think, though he attributed them to Arnold. Lewis, beside me, looked unimpressed. I said quietly that it was the habit of men who have once been admired to remind the world of it. Dale spoke of Kellaway in the past tense with unsettling ease. A tragedy, yes, though not unexpected, he said. Too much conscience is a dangerous thing. Around the table there were polite nods, Oxford's ritual of agreement through silence. I asked whether Kellaway had been working on anything of late. Dale replied that he had, something about romantic forgery. Then he smiled, a small private smile that didn't reach his eyes. Later, over port, he began to tell a story about a conference in Paris years ago, how Kellaway had misquoted Wordsworth during a debate on poetic integrity. He chuckled at the recollection. It was an error Kellaway had apparently never forgiven himself for. I listened, not to the story, but to the cadence of Dale's speech. Each sentence ended with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to being the final authority in any room. When the conversation drifted, I excused myself and wandered through the cloisters. The cold stone beneath my hands felt damp, almost breathing. Through an open window I could hear the faint hum of the kitchen below. Plates, running water, the small noises that make solitude bearable. Lewis found me there, his breath rising in small clouds. He said Dale was hiding something. I asked what made him think so. He said he quotes himself too easily. I looked at him, not quite understanding. He explained that Dale had repeated a phrase he'd used earlier in the interview. The exact same rhythm, the same self-conscious pause afterward, as though rehearsed. It stayed with me. That repetition. Words spoken twice are never identical. They carry the residue of intent. Back in my rooms that night, I took out Kellaway's notebook. Between the Latin quotations and marginalia, I found a brief note, written in haste. Dale, line 7, false. Nothing more. I wondered then if Kellaway, precise as ever, had been correcting not literature, but life, marking the moment when Dale had plagiarized something far more dangerous than verse. I remembered, too, that in his lecture draft, Kellaway had underlined the phrase, "Genius is not the opposite of deceit." Perhaps he had discovered proof that Dale's celebrated book, the one that had secured him tenure, his reputation, was not wholly his own. A borrowed thought here, an unattributed phrase there. Academic theft concealed beneath eloquence. Yet proof is rarely the same as truth. When I confronted Dale as he was leaving, he stopped beneath the archway, the rain tracing his shoulders. He said softly that intellect is a cruel companion. It demands too much and forgives too little. I told him he was misquoting again. He smiled. Perhaps, he said, that's what survival requires. As he walked away, I noticed his gait, careful, almost rehearsed. And it struck me that he had practiced not honesty, but posture. A man quoting himself endlessly until even he believed the repetition. Back in my flat, I poured a small measure of whiskey and stared at the crossword I'd begun that morning. The clue read, "To steal elegantly, 5. I filled in the answer without hesitation. Echo. There are certain addresses one remembers for their sound alone. Rue de quelque chose, spoken softly, like the echo of a past indiscretion. The one written on the envelope had such a quality. Papeterie de Lyon. I imagined shutters, warm light, and the faint smell of salt from the Mediterranean. But the woman who opened her door when I arrived days later was nothing like the vision her stationery had promised. Hélène Roussel, though she still signed her letters Heston, lived in a narrow house above a tobacconist in Montpellier. The air inside was dense with perfume and the slow decay of old music. She offered coffee I didn't want, sat opposite me in a robe of faded silk, and studied me with the patience of someone accustomed to being questioned. I told her who I was, why I'd come, and what her letter had failed to deliver. She said she hadn't expected to hear from England again. I asked if she'd known Dr. Kellaway well. She smiled. Not an admission, but a memory. He was the only man, she said, who could make silence sound like a virtue. I told her he was dead. Her hand trembled slightly, though her expression didn't change. Then she said she had come back to Oxford, briefly before it happened, to tell him something she should have told him long ago. When I asked what that was, she rose and crossed the room. There were photographs on a small bureau. The kind printed in faded silver, the faces ghostly now. One showed her as a young woman beside Kellaway, both of them in college gardens, their shadows impossibly close. She tapped the glass gently. He had promised me that our past would stay buried, she said, but the dead are rarely obedient. She turned, meeting my eyes. My daughter found the letters. She didn't say how, but I could guess. Oxford has a way of keeping old paper alive, drawers, archives, college basements where memory is filed by the decade. Claire Heston, the brilliant young lecturer, had rediscovered her mother's scandal. The revelation must have undone something delicate in all 3 of them. I asked Hélène if she thought Claire had written the letter found after Kellaway's death. She hesitated, then shook her head. The handwriting, she said, was hers. She had written to warn him, to say that Claire knew and that she herself had told her the truth. But she insisted she had left Oxford the same day, before nightfall. I believed her. There was no triumph in her tone, only fatigue. Before I left, she asked if he had suffered. I said only that he had died at his desk, in the light of his own lamp. She nodded once, as though that detail, the lamp, meant something. Then she said quietly that he had always been afraid of the dark. That evening, back in my hotel room, I opened the balcony doors to the warm southern wind. The street below was bright with noise, the smell of cigarettes and coffee drifting upward. I wrote notes in the half-light, the sea visible in the distance like a withheld confession. If Hélène had told him that Claire knew, then perhaps his final hours were spent in a kind of reckoning, between the man he had been and the one his reputation required him to remain. There was, however, one phrase she had used that troubled me. The dead are rarely obedient. It lingered long after the conversation ended. Did she mean Kellaway, or herself, or something larger? The idea that memory, once awakened, refuses to lie still. On the flight home, I reread her letter, the one retrieved from the porter's register. The handwriting was graceful, yes, but the ink faintly blotted, as if copied. Something about it no longer fit. Perhaps it wasn't the letter Kellaway received, but the one meant for him that never quite arrived. A shadow correspondence. When the plane touched down through the fog, Oxford was waiting again. Cold, grey, half familiar. I looked out at the drizzle streaking across the tarmac and thought how distance never really separates the living from the dead. It merely alters the temperature of regret. That night I poured a drink and wrote one line in my notebook. Truth travels faster than forgiveness. Then I turned off the lamp, letting the dark close in, obedient, at least, for a while. It was well past midnight when I returned to the case file. The flat was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the radiator and the faint tick of a clock that always seemed to run a second too slow. I poured a whiskey, sat beneath the lamp, and unfolded the crossword Kellaway had left unfinished. The pencil marks were faint, smudged at the corners as though rubbed by a restless hand. The grid, at first glance, appeared ordinary. Yet something in its symmetry disturbed me. The precise repetition of letters, the balance too deliberate. 2 O's where only one was needed, a down clue left blank though its answer was obvious. It was the crossword of a man who knew he was running out of time. Lewis had once said that all puzzles were just confessions with better manners. I thought of that now, tracing the faint line between clue and code. The across entries formed a familiar pattern: truth, coda, light, sin. Too heavy a quartet for coincidence. It was the down clues, though, that stopped me. Their initials, read vertically, spelled Dale did it. I almost smiled. Too theatrical. Too tidy. Kellaway had never cared for melodrama, and yet, beneath that false neatness, one letter refused to conform. The unchecked R in the corner, meaningless at first, began to trouble me. A single, unconnected letter, unclaimed by either word. I looked again at the completed lines. Lux mea deserta est. My light is gone, and below it, Claire. Not Claire, but the French spelling. There it was. Not accusation, but farewell. The puzzle was not a message to the police. It was meant for her. The repetition of coda, the hidden name, the word for light, all fragments of something private, a final communication disguised as intellect. The next morning, I returned to Corpus. The college was quieter than usual, the quad swept clean by wind. I found Claire in the library, surrounded by open books she was no longer reading. The air smelled of dust and resignation. She didn't look surprised to see me. She said softly that her mother had written, that she knew now about the past. I told her Kellaway had left her something, a will, a message, a kind of forgiveness. She asked if forgiveness and cowardice were the same thing. I said they often were. When I showed her the crossword, her hand trembled slightly. She recognized the handwriting, the rhythm of his mind. She said he had once told her that a crossword, properly designed, was a confession that could never be used in court. I asked if she had seen him that night. She said she had not. Then, after a pause, that she had walked toward his rooms but turned back at the door. She had heard music, she said. Schumann softly played. Then silence. She couldn't remember if the lamp was still burning. There was nothing left to ask. We sat in the stillness of the library for a while. Through the window, a shaft of light fell across the table, cutting through the dust like an accusation. She said she had loved him once, not as a man, but as an idea. I told her that ideas make poor companions. She smiled. Not kindly. Neither do policemen, she said. When she left, she touched the crossword lightly, as one might a relic. I waited until the door closed behind her before folding it back into my pocket. That evening, I filed my report. The official version was brief. Death by misadventure. No third-party involvement. But in the margin of my notes, I wrote a single line. A man does not die from poison alone. Outside, the bells of Magdalen began their slow toll for evensong. I turned off the light and sat in the half-darkness, thinking of Kellaway's final puzzle. Its symmetry, its silence. Somewhere within it, I suspected, was the truest definition of truth. Something shaped carefully enough to remain unsolved. By the time I found her, evening had folded itself into the river mist. Oxford was at its most deceptive then. The air soft, the streets still, the city pretending to be older than it was. Clare's flat overlooked Magdalen Bridge, a place where too many people have stood wondering whether to cross or not. She answered the door without surprise, as though she had been expecting the inevitable. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rain and the faintest trace of music. Schumann again, played too quietly to hear properly. A single lamp burned beside her, its shade a dull amber that turned everything inside the room into a memory. She looked exhausted, but not frightened. Perhaps she had already accepted the story that had been waiting for her since birth. I told her what I had pieced together, how the crossword, the will, and the letter formed a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. How Kellaway, in his meticulous way, had chosen to leave his confession in symbols rather than words. How he had poisoned himself before anyone could accuse him of corruption, moral or otherwise. She listened in silence, her hands resting loosely in her lap. When I said that I believed she had gone to him that night, her eyes flickered, not in denial but in fatigue. She said she had only wanted to stop him, that he had promised her mother the past would remain buried, that when she arrived the wine had already been poured, the glass already half empty. He had been calm, she said, impossibly calm. He told her the truth was best served cold, a line she didn't understand until the next morning when she learned he was dead. She had blown out one of the lamps, she admitted, before leaving the room. She couldn't bear the thought of him lit like a relic. I asked if she'd loved him. She said she didn't know. That love, for people like her mother and Kellaway, was simply a more sophisticated form of control. Then, after a pause, she added that he had been kind once, before the guilt began to feed on itself. Kindness, she said, always dies before love does. There was nothing left to charge her with, nothing I wished to. The poison was his own, the secrecy mutual. Even Lewis would have seen the futility of naming villains where there were only ruins. Still, I wrote the report that night, each sentence shorter than it needed to be. Words, after all, can only approximate truth. They never contain it. Later, I walked back through the city. The rain had begun again, slow and deliberate. Corpus lay in darkness, save for a single lamp still burning in the porter's lodge, that small, stubborn reminder of duty. I stood outside the gate for a long time, watching the reflection of the lamp tremble in the puddles. Somewhere, a bell marked the half hour. Somewhere else, unseen, a door closed. In my pocket was the final page from Kellaway's notebook. Not a confession, not even an explanation. Just a single line, written in that careful, ascetic hand. We live by light, borrowed from others. It was the sort of phrase that meant everything and nothing. I could almost hear him saying it. That dry, deliberate tone that made even tragedy sound like scholarship. When I reached home, I poured myself a drink and turned off all but one lamp. The silence was dense, the air heavy with a kind of completion I couldn't name. I thought of Kellaway's desk, of Claire's trembling hands, of Hélène Roussel standing by her window in the French light. Each of them had tried, in their own way, to contain what could not be contained, desire, guilt, remembrance. I realized then that the case had not been about deceit or even redemption. It had been about illumination. How much light a person can bear before it burns through the skin, and how easily the truth hides in its shadow. When I finally switched off the lamp, the darkness came softly, without resistance. The room seemed to breathe for a moment, as if relieved. Outside, the rain continued, steady, unremarkable, endless. The kind of rain that falls when the story has already ended, but the night hasn't yet learned it. Weeks passed before the quiet returned. Not peace, never peace, but the slower rhythm of an Oxford winter reasserting itself. The leaves had gone from the trees along Merton Street, the mornings sharpened by frost, the city wrapped again in its habitual civility. The newspapers had already forgotten Kellaway, his name surviving only in the Latin minutes of the college council, one paragraph between condolences and endowments. That, I thought, was how Oxford buried its dead, not with ceremony, but with syntax. I found myself drawn back to Corpus one Sunday evening, walking alone through the fog that had begun to settle over the quad. The chapel bell was tolling 7, its sound measured and unhurried. The gates were open for evensong, and I slipped inside. The organist was practicing, a slow, uncertain prelude that faltered midway, as if unwilling to continue. The faint smell of candle wax mingled with stone dust. I sat near the back. Across the aisle, the college fellows filed in, their gowns whispering against the pews. Among them, I saw no trace of Dale. He had resigned, I'd heard, quietly and without protest, leaving Oxford for what the head of college called a period of reflection. I doubted reflection would improve him. As for Claire, she was gone too, a post in Vienna or perhaps Geneva. No one seemed quite sure. Oxford rarely looks over its shoulder once the gates have closed. When the service began, I let the words drift past. Psalms half remembered from childhood. Latin phrases I understood too well. Between the readings, I caught sight of the chapel window, the Corpus pelican feeding its young with its own blood. The glass glowed faintly in the dusk, the image both grotesque and tender. I wondered whether Kellaway had ever sat where I sat now, looking at that same window, trying to persuade himself that sacrifice could redeem. After the final hymn, I stayed behind as the others filed out. The organist, an elderly man, nodded in recognition and went on playing softly, improvising something that might once have been Bach. The melody trembled like an unanswered question. I thought of Kellaway's last words, written in that austere hand. We live by light, borrowed from others. It occurred to me that the college, the city, perhaps even the whole of human learning, existed on that same principle. One mind illuminating another, sometimes gently, sometimes to the point of blindness. Outside, the fog thickened. The porter's lamp burned at the gate, its flame a small defiance against the dark. I paused beside it, looking up at the window that had once held the light of Kellaway's room. Now it was empty, curtains drawn, glass reflecting only the pale haze of the street. There was no comfort in it, only the symmetry of absence. Lewis met me later at the Randolph. He had the look of a man who wanted to talk and hoped I wouldn't let him. We drank in silence for a while before he asked if I ever regretted knowing too much. I told him knowing wasn't the problem, believing was. He didn't press the point. Some truths, I've learned, sound less convincing when spoken aloud. When he left, I remained at the bar, watching the faint condensation trace the outside of my glass. The pianist in the corner played something aimless and soft. It might have been Schumann again, or merely my imagination completing the melody. That night, back in my flat, I opened the file one last time. The crossword, the photograph, the letter. Each artifact reduced to paper and inference. I replaced them carefully, closed the folder, and set it on the shelf beside a dozen others that had ended in the same imperfect quiet. Outside, the rain had begun again, steady and unremarkable. I turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the faint sound of water on the glass. The city was still breathing. Its bells, its ghosts, its endless rehearsals of guilt and grace. Perhaps that is Oxford's only constant. The light goes out, and yet the walls remember how it once looked,